History as it happens, July 12, 2022. To cede or not to cede?
Russia is a regional power that is threatening some of its immediate neighbors.
Any violation of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity would be deeply destabilizing.
Imagine if instead Russia had engaged in true diplomacy.
It's a ceasefire agreement that has not held. It was signed in February 2015, the second part of the Minsk agreement.
The Russian President Vladimir Putin has launched a major military operation against Ukraine. Speaking on national television, Mr. Putin urged Ukrainian
Around
troops
1,000
to lay
people are
down
thought to have been inside this shopping centre in central Ukraine when it was hit today by a Russian missile.
We are going to support Ukraine as long as it takes.
Nearly 5 months after Russia's unprovoked and premeditated invasion of Ukraine, war grinds on in the Donbas. Ukraine's leader vows his countrymen will fight for every inch of territory. Vladimir Putin remains bent on breaking what appears to be a stalemate, as little land has changed hands in recent weeks. So where are the diplomats? What's the point of continuing this war? That's next as we report history as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
And the Ukrainians now are looking at an occupier of 20% or more of their territory, not a situation that they want to solidify, freeze. And they see that the West is continuing and even accelerating the flow of weapons to them, to the Ukrainians, to allow them to push the Russians back.
Let's begin with a headline from the Washington Times. Ukraine gets $400 million of U.S. war supplies. Analysts ask, how long can it go on? The article goes on to say it is the 15th drawdown of U.S. weapons and other military hardware to send to Kyiv since August 2021. So how long can it go on? President Biden answered that question at his news conference at the NATO summit in Madrid.
We are going to support Ukraine as long as it takes. Look at the impact that the war on Ukraine has had on Russia. They've had to renege on their national debt for the first time since the beginning, almost well over 100 years. They've lost 15 years of the gains they made in terms of their economy. They're in a situation where they're having trouble because of my imposition of dealing with what can be exported to Russia.
It is perhaps worth noting that Russia's leaders are still undeterred by Western involvement in the war and by U.S. sanctions. Around the same time President Biden was speaking at the NATO summit, Vladimir Putin delivered some remarks of his own in Moscow.
Если этот самый Запад хотел спровоцировать конфликт для того, чтобы перейти.
The so-called collective West, said Putin, headed by the United States, have been behaving exceptionally aggressively toward Russia over the decades. The war has been unleashed, the sanctions have been introduced, but there's something I would like to point out, said Putin. They should have understood they have already lost. That is, Vladimir Putin on July 7th. Now, that doesn't sound like someone who's ready to declare victory and withdraw from Ukraine, where the fighting is now concentrated in the Donbas region. As I speak into this microphone in early July, Russia is preparing to assault Donetsk. Now, Ukraine's President Vladimir Zelensky, in an interview with CNN's Wolf Blitzer, shot down the possibility of ceding territory to Russia in a possible deal to end the war.
Are you willing to cede any territory at all to Russia to make a peace deal and end this war?
Ukrainians are not ready to give up their land as new territories of the Russian Federation. This is our land. We have always said this, and we will never give it up.
Now, when it comes to ceding territory, no one in a position to do so has made an offer. We just talk about it a lot on this podcast. It's a hypothetical right now. So again, I ask, where are the diplomats? How else is this war going to end? When Ukraine expels every last Russian soldier? When Russian tanks roll into Kyiv? When one side or the other exhausts its reserves? Or maybe Russia will be satisfied with the Donbas and Black Sea coast and end its campaign once those objectives are achieved. Is it even possible to return to the Minsk agreement of 2015, which both sides interpreted differently? Russia thought the deal guaranteed it would retain influence over the Donbas to the point where Ukraine could never be truly sovereign. I really don't have any answers here, but I do have that question. Where are the diplomats? As you know from my recent episodes, I've become uncomfortable with the open-ended U.S. commitment to Ukraine, not because I want Russia to win, because of the way the Biden White House, State Department, public intellectuals have talked up the war into something of cosmic importance that'll decide the fate of democracy in a global struggle against autocracy. Or as Anatol Lieven wrote in an op-ed in the National Interest, the war permits a return to the full spirit of the Cold War, paranoid, perpetually mobilized, and militarized, for which the foreign policy establishment has been yearning ever since the Cold War ended. Now, it should go without saying that I recognize the war is of existential importance to Ukraine. Maybe it's time for the U.S. to exert some of its leverage here and work harder to bring about a negotiated settlement, because that's how this is going to end. Total victory by one side or the other is an illusion. But maybe Vladimir Putin is chasing that illusion and is not interested in peace. Ambassador William Taylor is an expert on Russia and Europe at the U.S. Institute of Peace. In 2019, he served as chargé d'affaires at the U.S. Embassy in Kyiv, and he was the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine from 2006 to 2009. Anatol Lieven is a senior research fellow on Russia and Europe at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. Ambassador William Taylor, welcome. Welcome to the studio.
Thank you, Martin. It's good to be here.
Yeah, it's good to have you here in person. Anatol Lieven, it is nice to see you over Zoom in the UK still. Welcome.
Hello, thank you.
I was wondering where you were, if they had shipped you off to Antarctica or something, because earlier this week when I emailed you to find out if you were in Washington, I received no reply.
No, not in Washington, still in England, alas, but I will be, I'll be over in late August, early September.
All right, I'm going to hold you to that. So let's get down to business, shall we? And I'm going to pose my first question to you, Mr. Ambassador. How are we going to end this? Where are the diplomats?
So the diplomats are thinking about what comes next. Both sides are continuing to fight. Both sides believe that now's not the time for negotiations. I understand probably the Ukrainians better. Anatol will understand the Russians better. But on the Ukrainian side, they see that the West is committed and has committed several times over the past 2 weeks in various fora, large meetings of Western leaders. And as you say, President Biden and others have talked about be there as long as it takes. The Ukrainians are counting on that. And the Ukrainians now are looking at an occupier of 20% or more of their territory, not a situation that they want to solidify, freeze. And they see that the West is continuing and even accelerating the flow of weapons to them, to the Ukrainians, to allow them to push the Russians back. At the time the Russians are pushed back, when the Ukrainians can push the Russians back to somewhere close to the lines, the disposition on the 24th of February, you'll see the Ukrainians, I imagine, ready to sit down and talk.
So it's going to take more war before we get to the negotiations. Anatol, do you agree with that?
Well, that's not what the Ukrainians are saying. I talked to a Ukrainian ambassador a couple of weeks ago. He may have been speaking for himself, but the Ukrainian foreign minister has said some similar things, and President Zelensky has said some, well, very contradictory things on the subject. What he said was that Ukraine is prepared to fight for 20 years if necessary, that was his phrase, to reconquer everything that the Russians have taken since 2014, including Crimea and Sevastopol. The Russians I've talked to, including people who certainly in the past were considered moderate and pro-Western, say that Russia will fight for 20 or indeed 100 years to retain Crimea.
But is it possible, Anatol, sorry to interrupt, is it possible that what President Zelensky and the Ukrainians are saying publicly is different than what they're thinking privately about how to get a way out of this?
That may be so. All I can say is this guy and other Ukrainians I've talked to sounded sincere.
So I had a conversation, I'm told, yesterday with a member of the government who was very clear about where his government, including his president, is. And I'm sure he's well coordinated with the foreign minister. And that is, and it's not inconsistent with what you said, that is, the Ukrainians will not give up claim to Ukrainian territory, to territory that is internationally recognized as Ukrainian. And that includes Donbas, and yes, it includes Crimea. That said, there is a strong indication, I think President Zelensky has been pretty clear about this, that if the military lines, if the fighting, as you say, Martin, goes such that the Russians are pushed back, the Ukrainians push the Russians back to the lines of February 24th, the negotiations can at least start at that point. But the key there is their expectation, their commitment, their determination not to give up formal claim to Ukrainian territory.
The problem there, you see, is that as long as this question of the formal claim remains unsettled, I mean, unless you got cast iron guarantees from the Ukrainians, and guaranteed by us as well, that they would not, for example, resume their blockade of Crimea's water. And then, of course, there is the question of the separatist areas of the Donbas, which is extremely complicated. You see, the problem is that the Russians will want, if only as a military guarantee, to hold on to everything that they have taken so far. They can't afford militarily to give it up. I mean, this is the argument in favor of trying. Now, believe me, I'm not naive about this. I believe there was a chance earlier on in the war. It may have been comprehensively lost. But you see, that is the argument for attempting actually to solve these issues now, rather than kicking them endlessly down the road. It seems to me that the only way is to do what we resorted to in Kosovo in the end, which is local democracy. Have a referendum. I know it's very difficult in the Donbas because, of course, so many refugees on both sides, but ultimately have a referendum under international supervision.
We know once the first drop of blood is spilled, everything changes. I mean, the implication of my question was, do we need to have the war go on for several more months until the facts on the ground are changed to the point where the Ukrainians feel comfortable with some type of negotiated settlements? Because that might not happen. The war could turn even worse for them than it is now, as it appears anyway. We have to be careful when we're predicting how the war might go. So, to my question, where are the diplomats? At the G20 ministers meeting, Secretary of State Blinken did not meet with his Russian counterpart, Sergei Lavrov. Mr. Ambassador, why not? I mean, why aren't they talking to each other? That's not a rhetorical question. Maybe it is. Go ahead.
Rhetorical or not, Martin, in order to have a meaningful dialogue with people, with Anatol, with you, Lavrov, and Blinken, there has to be some modicum of respect and support and trust. And the international community has not been given the reason to trust what Minister Lavrov says, or indeed what President Putin says, because they assured us that they would not invade Ukraine over and over. Indeed, they mocked press and Westerners for saying, it's the United States just kind of whipping up hysteria. We're not going to. Come on. So the trust is just not there.
Is it because the Russians simply don't want to stop, that they want the whole of Ukraine?
Of course they want the whole of Ukraine. President Putin has been very clear about his goal. He doesn't think Ukraine is a country. Therefore, it's not sovereign. Therefore, to invade it is not to violate sovereignty. He believes that Ukraine is and should be part of Russia. So how do you negotiate with that? How do the Ukrainians negotiate? How does the international community negotiate with that?
Whenever I raise this issue about negotiated settlement, that implies that the Russians actually do want to stop at some point and not take the whole of Ukraine.
Well, first of all, if you go by the people, who have influenced Putin on this, starting with Solzhenitsyn, for example, they haven't been saying that Ukraine should be part of Russia. They've been saying Ukraine should be closely linked with Russia and friendly, which is not exactly the same thing. Belarus is closely linked to Russia without being, simply a province of Russia. But the other thing to note here is that there have always been two Russian agendas in Ukraine. Basically, the first one, and then if that fails, the second one. Now, the first one, as the ambassador has said, was indeed to keep Ukraine as a whole in close alliance with Russia, or at the very least to keep it out of close alliance with the West, a sort of negative sphere of influence. And undoubtedly, in my view, Putin's original plan was to capture Kiev, but it's important to note that due to Ukrainian courage and grit and unity, and due, of course, to our weapons as well, that agenda failed. And my view is that if you look at military realities on the ground, it simply cannot be revived. The Russians withdrew from around Kiev at the end of March. And given that they have been had to fight very, very hard for weeks just to capture a couple of relatively small cities in the Donbas, it seems to me that the idea that they could conquer the whole of Ukraine is absurd. So what they've done is they have resorted to Plan B, which is very clearly set out, by the way, Solzhenitsyn, many others, and indeed implicit in what Putin has been saying as well, which is if a majority of Ukrainians really want to leave, they can. But if they do so, they must return to Russia those territories which, now here the ambiguity begins, those territories which were never part of historic Ukraine. That could mean, of course, all of southern and eastern Ukraine, what the Russians call Novorossiya, which was conquered from the Crimean Tatars by Russia in the 18th century. Or it could mean the minimal version of that, which is just Crimea and the Donbas. And, there have been tremendous ambiguities on that on the Russian side. But it seems to me that what the Russians have done is they have, so I'm told by Russians, they have now, after all, they're not stupid. They must see that both militarily and politically, it is quite impossible now to subjugate the whole of Ukraine. And they have resorted to Plan B, which is to get back, and this is then where, I think you're probably right. It will be decided militarily on the ground.
Though,
as much as possible.
Russia will continue to enjoy military preeminence over its neighbor. Maybe it seems like a long shot today that they might roll tanks into Kyiv again. But they also, meaning Russian military leaders, Vladimir Putin and his circle of elites who run the country, they may be banking on exhaustion on the part of the Ukrainians, because the Russians are the more powerful side here.
Well, they are, but more powerful sides can still be fought to a standstill. Some experience of that in American history.
See Vietnam.
And indeed in European history as well. The Ukrainians did fight Russia to a standstill outside Kiev, as I say. They beat them back from the attempt to capture Mykolaiv and Odessa and Kharkov. And say, if the Ukrainians can, with our military backing, which, by the way, don't get me wrong, I do not oppose, can impose such delays and such losses on the Russians as they have done so far, it is hardly unreasonable to think, as I say, a Russian government will move from Plan A to Plan B. And as I say, the difference between Plan A and Plan B has been set out very clearly in Russian writings. What is in doubt, of course, is just how far, not so much how far the Russians will go, because undoubtedly they would like still, if they could, to take, Odessa and the whole of the Black Sea coast. Whether that is any longer militarily possible, I think, is seriously questionable.
There's a question of whether they need a mass mobilization because they're running out of fresh troops.
Well, indeed. And it's very interesting that Putin, for all his rhetoric and all his attempt to establish a much tighter grip on the economy and, of course, on the media and on public opinion, has not yet dared. That's the interesting thing, of course, as well, that Ukraine and everybody else in the world has said, obviously, that this is a war. The Russians are still calling it a special military operation. Now, that's quite important because that indicates that they are not yet willing, or they don't yet dare, perhaps, fully to try to mobilize the Russian population. But would you forgive me if I just replied to something the ambassador said earlier?
Sure.
When it comes to diplomacy, starting from a standpoint of trust, I really don't think is the correct beginning because, of course, the Russians say in return that they trusted the West to do certain things and were betrayed by us. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that is right, but the problem is that then one simply gets into the business of insults. Look, if we could trust the Taliban enough to negotiate with them, we trusted Mao, or America did in the 1970s at the height of the Cultural Revolution. But the second thing is, I really do not think one should use the phrase international community anymore to mean white people plus Japan. It doesn't go down well in the rest of the world, quite apart from China and large parts of Africa and large parts of Latin America. The Indians really do not like being told that the international community is basically the white world telling everybody else that you're with us or against us. Let's just say the West and its allies.
Mr. Ambassador, if you'd like to respond to any and all of what Mr. Lieven said, because I have some questions for you, but go ahead if you'd like to respond.
No, I'll go back to Plan B. I agree with Anatol that they were defeated. The Russians were defeated in their attempt to take Kyiv and replace Zelensky. And I agree that they apparently have downsized their goal not to take the entire country, which I agree is militarily impossible, and to focus on Donbas. And as Anatol rightly said, they've battered themselves in order to take 2 towns in Luhansk. And President Putin has now said, take a pause because of that battering. And their next step undoubtedly will continue to be toward Donetsk. But the idea that because they've downsized their goal, that should be in any way acceptable to the West, to Ukrainians, to people who care about some kind of an international order whereby nations can live and work and interact without war, that order is challenged by Plan B just as much as Plan A. So it's that goal that the West, I take Anatol's point.
Because the global South is not joining the sanctions on Russia, the global South, India, and also China, and also a number of the ministers I mentioned at the G20 all met with Lavrov, but not the United States. Go ahead, Mr. Ambassador.
Yeah, and we also remember in the UN, in the Security Council, where China did not support Russia. They abstained. It was 11-1 in the Security Council. It was 141-5 in the General Assembly. And again, the Chinese and the Indians and the Brazilians and others that you mentioned, Martin, abstained. They didn't support the Russians. Russians were supported by, the Syrians, the Belarusians, and the Eritreans, and the North Koreans, That's the kind of support they were able to get in the General Assembly. So, all to say, yes, there's a hesitation, understandable, on the part of the Indians who buy a lot of weapons from the Russians. They're probably reconsidering those purchases of weapons. Russian weapons haven't done great in a lot of these things. But nonetheless, Indians and others have concerns. And so they have been abstaining from these votes.
Here's Indonesia's foreign minister at the G20 meeting. He said the growing food and energy crises caused by the war meant that it was the world's responsibility to end the war sooner than later and settle our differences at the negotiating table, not the battlefield. I mean, easier said than done, of course, but I think the message is I hope no one agrees with what Russia is doing here. I don't want to overstate it, but it seems there is a consensus globally that Russia's war of aggression is wrong, even if some countries don't want to join the sanctions. But my question is then, how can we end it before more thousands of people are killed, more millions are turned into refugees, or we get to that point, which has happened throughout history in war, where you cross a point of no return? Anatol, you get my point, right? At some point, there's no turning back because so much, it's the sunk cost fallacy is what I'm getting at in my long-winded question.
Yes. Well, that's what I'm afraid of. And of course, Henry Kissinger said much the same thing, a few weeks ago.
I don't know if I want to be in the same company as Kissinger, but go ahead.
Well,
I'm kidding.
No, possibly not. But, when it comes to these issues, one can't necessarily choose one's company. A key point to be made is that, as indeed Ambassador Taylor has said, we will end up ultimately with some kind of de facto territorial compromise, even if it's only Crimea, will remain in Russia's hands.
I haven't said that yet, but I'd be happy to. I'll try to clarify when we get to that. But go ahead.
Sure. But it seems to me that, also for purely military reasons, that is likely to be the outcome, given that for the Ukrainians to be able to counterattack sufficiently to drive Russia out of all the territory they've taken except Crimea is also going to be a colossal military task. Now, I think here that there are 2 additional points to be made. The first is, as you suggested, Martin, there are other issues and interests in play. The United States, as the self-assumed, but also, within Europe, recognized global hegemon, does have wider responsibilities, including global food supplies, which in turn, of course, have potentially, as we saw during the genesis of the Arab Spring and the Syrian civil war, massive potential implications for political stability and the rise of extremism in various parts of the world, including most notably the Muslim world. There is the whole question of international energy prices. There is, if this is something that one recognizes and cares about, the extremely negative consequences of this war for action against climate change. So, all of these are wider issues. The second point is that from Ukraine's point of view, the best thing, the great thing that has emerged from this war is that it seems, touch wood, that at last they have, because of the sympathy generated in Europe, a serious chance of joining the European Union. Previously, if you talk to European diplomats in private, West European diplomats, they said, this was something which might happen in generations to come. Now there is a new commitment, but it's still going to be a very difficult process. This is far, far more complicated than joining NATO because, of course, of the acquis communautaire, all the laws you have to sign up to. And, of course, this cannot really begin as long as Ukraine is in a state of war and wartime mobilization. So I think, from Ukraine's own point of view, that is another incentive to try to end this conflict, or at least to try to move it to something like Cyprus, the Turkish declaration of the Republic of North Cyprus, which of course nobody has recognized, the island remains partitioned, but where there hasn't been a resumption of war since the 1970s, rather than a conflict that I've been covering for 37 years now, which is Kashmir, which of course periodically blows up again into terrifying violence between two nuclear-armed states.
Yes. Thank you for rolling with my joke about Mr. Kissinger, Anatol Lieven. But I did bring Kissinger up recently. I had a couple of historians, Jeffrey Engel and Jeremy Suri, on the podcast, and I brought up Kissinger's idea, which I do happen to agree with, that there will probably need to be a cession of territory to end the war.
Martin, I looked at the transcript of Kissinger's remarks.
Maybe I'm wrong then.
Davos. I thought that too because of all the press that had been surrounding it. But I looked hard. He didn't say that. That what I heard he had said, that is, that Zelensky would have to give up territory. He didn't say that. What he said was negotiations at some point are going to be necessary. And he actually quoted President Zelensky, who has said the same thing at some point. And Zelensky has said that once the lines, the dispositions get back to February 24th, he'd be willing to sit down. And just last thing on the wider issues. And by the way, the distinction between hegemon and imperialist is an interesting one. Hegemon, people want to join hegemon. They want to support a hegemon. Whereas the imperialism is an attempt to kind of pull people in.
I do want to return to the issue.
On the wider issues, maybe this is what you're on the wider issues. It is true. This war, as you point out, Martin, war of aggression, has resulted in higher food prices, higher energy prices, possibility of mass movements of people, and the source of that problem is clear, as you've indicated.
I do want to return to the issue of world orders and whether or not this, how should I put it, bipolar world order versus a multipolar world, because I think that's relevant to this discussion. But I have a question for you, Mr. Ambassador, and that is about ceding territory and the Donbas. So you were in Kyiv as the ambassador to Ukraine, 2006 to 2010. That was Viktor Yushchenko's presidency, correct?
Correct.
We know he gave way to Viktor Yanukovych. We know what happened to him in 2014. Yanukovych was elected, according to a foreign policy article that I have brought up many times on this podcast. I brought it up with Anatol in the past, and he may remember it. This was written by Alexander Motil, a political scientist at Rutgers University, Newark. The headline was, "It's time for Ukraine to let the Donbas go." This was written in 2019, so several years into the separatist war, but 2 years before the war we're talking about today. He said it was the Donbas that made Viktor Yanukovych, whose political career was dedicated to bringing Ukraine back into Russia's orbit, president in 2010. Motil's point is that without the Donbas, Ukraine can westernize, as it has wanted to do, right? The majority of Ukrainians. So my question to you, hang with me, I will get to the question, is if some informed observers thought that giving up the Donbas was okay a few years ago, why is it not okay now?
Informed observers. There are a lot of informed observers. I'm an informed observer. Yeah. You are. Anatol is. We don't vote. We are not Ukrainians. And Mr. Model has interesting views. Smart man, very smart man, has a lot of good observations. He said this before 2019. I mean, he's been on this for some time. And Ukraine is sovereign. President Putin doesn't want to acknowledge that, but the Ukrainians, and this gets to your point about world order, the Ukrainians are sovereign. It's a sovereign nation. They get to decide, and it's undoubtedly true that a Ukraine without Crimea, without Donbas, would be a different political animal. So, yeah, you can understand his argument, but it's a sovereign nation.
And now that the war started, maybe it's too late for that.
The Ukrainians get to decide.
Yeah, but two things there. First, our weapons have been critical to Ukraine's ability to resist. In the process, we have suffered considerable economic damage ourselves and, as I say, taken responsibility in a way. Not that we caused this, but, still, the economic consequences for the world are very severe indeed.
Anatol, when you say we, you mean the United States, the West. Okay, good.
Yeah. And we are running, I trust small, but not negligible risks of escalation towards a much more dangerous conflict between Russia and the West. And, of course, in the process, we're considerably strengthening China's position in the world. Sorry, but that gives us, or America, if you will, a say in a peace settlement in Ukraine. Otherwise, we're giving a blank check to the Ukrainian government. Now, the second thing is, and I'm sure, Ambassador Taylor knows this even better than me, there are very significant differences within the Ukrainian government and the Ukrainian political elites more widely. Zelensky has faced enormous opposition, obviously domestically. So it's not enough to say Ukraine is sovereign. America is sovereign, but there have been some rather considerable differences among Americans over policy. But the other thing is that here, we come into questions of international law, which, more widely are a lot more ambiguous than the West has made out. If you look at the aftermath of empires, including Yugoslavia, our position in Kosovo, my God, Ireland, If you say Ukraine is sovereign, does that mean the Ukrainian people are sovereign? In that case, do the people of Crimea have a say in where they go, or the people of Donbas? There is, after all, an issue of local democracy here, which in other cases, we have taken the opposite view of, not just Kosovo, but southern Sudan. So you see, this is not simply an open and shut question there, which is why I keep coming back to local democracy as the only way that we can get out of this mess, while also preserving some modicum of respect for rules as opposed to simply military force.
Interesting use of words there, Anatol. Local democracy, because some have made this out to be an issue of global democracy. Correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. Ambassador. I believe you have written about this issue. There's more on the line in Kyiv and in Ukraine than simply whether Ukraine remains a democratic country or aspiring democracy is really a better way of putting it.
There are certainly implications for, as Anatol just indicated, for the rules-based order coming out of this conflict in Ukraine. On the question of sovereignty. So I was in Ukraine both in 2019, but then I went back in January this year.
Okay, that's right.
So 3 weeks before the invasion. And I talked to President Zelensky, I talked to opposition leaders, and indeed, Anatol is exactly right. Before the invasion, opposition leaders were doing what opposition leaders do. They were expressing strong views about the mistakes that President Zelensky was making. And President Zelensky's support was in the 30s. He was still the most popular person in the country and the leader that they looked to more than anybody else. But it was still in the 30s. That changed on the 24th of February. And the opposition leaders that I talked to at the end of January, 3 weeks before the election, fell immediately into support for Zelensky. Their parties support Zelensky. He has, 92% support? All to say that, yes, the Ukrainian people are sovereign. The Ukrainian nation is sovereign, and they make their decisions in the way sovereign nations do. And on the business about local democracy, we could take that more seriously. And I know that there's history here, but one bit of the history is the referendum in Crimea.
Well, that was a joke, wasn't it?
It was a joke. It was a joke. It was, 97%? That sounds like North Korea. But there could be, there have been examples, as Anatol has indicated, internationally observed legitimate elections, referenda, asking the question, and that could be part of it.
Anatol, anything to add there before I move on to the next subject?
Well, I suppose, going back to Alexander Motil's point, there was a deep contradiction in the Ukrainian position about the Donbas from, say, 2015 on, the Minsk agreement. Because the Minsk agreement, which the Ukrainians signed, admittedly there were serious ambiguities in it, Germany and France brokered, Russia signed, America endorsed, provided for the Donbas to come back into Ukraine with full autonomy. Now, Ukrainian governments and parliaments, very understandably, did not wish to implement that because they feared, and certainly, that was also Russia's intention, that the Donbas would act as a form of fifth column within within Ukraine, acting as a block against Ukraine's progress towards the West. But you see, you can't have it both ways. If the Donbas is going to act in that way, and if militarily you've lost the eastern Donbas anyway, then Motil is right. Let it go.
So, Anatol, I'm glad you brought up the Minsk Accords. I was going to bring that up. I'm not doing a great job sticking to my own notes here, gentlemen, so thank you for that. I was going to ask, didn't Ukraine agree to the autonomy of all or part of the Donbas?
The answer is no. They signed the Minsk agreement. President Poroshenko, gun to his head, literally gun to his head, so under duress. The United States was not a party to this. The Germans and French were.
And the Russians said they weren't party to it either because those two areas in Ukraine were independent states in their view. Isn't that correct or no?
No, not at that stage.
No.
Not at that stage.
The Russians are there. But there was the word autonomy does not appear. There were certainly issues that had to do with local decision-making. That was certainly the case. As far as the Ukrainians were concerned, the Ukrainians did not agree to autonomy. Let's be clear about that.
Okay. Well, I think whatever was in the Minsk Accords, and again, it is ambiguous. It's not easy to tell what they actually called for, at least to my eyes. That situation better than what we're dealing with now, wouldn't you say?
Well, absolutely. But the other question there is, as far as the eastern Donbas is concerned, but Crimea as well, although I think all of us agree that Crimea, in effect, is lost to Ukraine. The question is also, how on earth would Ukraine ever rule these areas again without massive repression or possibly ethnic cleansing? Because we shouldn't forget, the eastern Donbas has been pretty severely bombarded by the Ukrainian forces for the past 8 years, just as the western Donbas has been very severely bombarded by Russian forces. My own view, talking to people on the ground, is that if one ever could manage to ask the local people their views, the eastern Donbas, as it existed separately until February the 24th, probably would vote a majority to go with Russia. I very much doubt that many people in the western Donbas, having been invaded and devastated by Russia over the past 4 months and more, would vote to go with Russia. I'm not saying that appealing to local democracy would work out wholly to Russia's advantage by any means.
The only comment on that is that the destruction of cities by the Russians, destruction of Ukrainian citizens by the Russians, cannot be compared to the damage to any of the cities in occupied Donbas. Let's be clear.
I entirely agree with that. The level of force has been on a vastly larger scale.
Yeah.
So as the kids say these days, Unpopular opinion, but here it is. I think President Obama had it right when he gave that interview to The Atlantic in 2016. He said Ukraine is not a core American interest. It is a Russian one, and there's nothing the United States can do, short of sending in the Marines, right, to negate this fact. Russia will have military preeminence over Ukraine. So right now it seems, and this is less a question than it is a statement, it seems the Biden administration sees this war as an opportunity for the U.S. to reassert its leadership in the world, for NATO to find its footing. But critics of that mindset, they would say that the U.S. needing to find a cause for its national rejuvenation by supporting Ukraine ignores the fact we're living in a multipolar world. It explains why other large countries, such as India and China, as we've discussed, are not on board with the West versus Russia narrative. But once you've built this conflict up to something of cosmic importance from the U.S. point of view, of course it is for the Ukrainians, it becomes very difficult to get out of it. The United States has already sent more than $50 billion to Ukraine this year, and as the president said, we're going to do it for as long as it takes. I mean, I'm worried we've already crossed a point from which we cannot return.
So, Martin, on your
my speech,
on your speech, and on your unpopular opinion, to imply that the United States, you almost implied, is using this or
President Biden's speech talking about a global struggle, democracy versus autocracy.
And the question, but my question is the causation. What caused that? What was the root cause of that? It was not the United States or NATO trying to enhance its power, its influence. No. It was an invasion. It was an international crime. It was the crime of aggression against a neighbor. That's what caused it. Now, that did generate then the response that you described. That is, NATO's stronger, NATO is more unified, NATO is more forward deployed, NATO is likely to be bigger, is likely to have the Finns and the Swedes join.
Right.
So NATO responded, but they responded. They didn't take the initiative to say, we're going to establish ourselves as a preeminent power in Europe. No, this was prompted by the Russian invasion.
No doubt about that. I'm just concerned about the U.S. response.
Your point, Martin, about who cares more about Ukraine. The Ukrainians care more about Ukraine than the Russians. I'm sure that's true. I'd be interested in Anatol's view on that. But I'm sure Ukrainians care about the sovereignty, the international existence of their country as an independent, as a free, as a sovereign nation. They care much more, and that's clear. That's clear in the battles. That's clear in the fight.
But I guess what I'm getting at, and Anatol, you can jump in after I rephrase my thoughts here. I guess this seductive idea that Anne Applebaum and Francis Fukuyama, who's been on this podcast, continue to talk about democracy versus autocracy, the fate of democracy is on the line in Ukraine, I think that's problematic.
Well, yes. I mean, where to begin? Look, the fate of democracy is on the line within America, in American elections. The fate of European democracy is on the line within Europe. It's to do with, what one sees, alas, in the last French parliamentary elections, the rise of extremist forces of left and right, which risk, making countries democratically ungovernable. The fate of democracy is on the line when it comes to the problems of the US Constitution. What is to some extent on the line in Ukraine is international law. Rules-based order, I find a US propagandist term which is really not useful empirically. But issues of international law, certainly, but they are somewhat more ambiguous. As far as democracy versus autocracy in the world as a whole is concerned, one must here draw, I think, a very clear line between what happens in Europe, and in Europe, of course, it was true in the Cold War as well, very much. You can draw not an absolutely clear line between democracy and autocracy, since, after all, Turkey is a member of NATO, and Hungary and Poland, which have distinctly illiberal versions of democracy now, are part of NATO and the European Union. Nonetheless, if you take the EU and NATO as a whole and contrast them with Russia and Belarus, the contrast is very obvious. I hardly need to say that elsewhere in the world, the contrast is not nearly so obvious. I worked first in South Asia and also for 7 years in the Middle East. And frankly, if you say to students there, that America stands for democracy and freedom, they burst out laughing. There is no evidence that America does so if you look at America's record, from Morocco across to South Asia. And of course, today, American hegemony in the region depends on a long row of autocratic states. So that's, the second thing. Now, on Obama's statement, that's very interesting because Obama was relying on military estimates, as was I, by the way, and just about everybody else, about, the overwhelmingly superior military power of Russia. Now, we all turned out to be mistaken to a very considerable extent.
After 5 months.
True, but the Russian failure outside Kiev was very notable. And after all, a whole range of people have said this now. Antony Blinken said it a week or so ago. The Ukrainians did win a great victory in the first month or so of the war. And in the process, in my view, did actually preserve the independence of by far the greater part of Ukraine, at least, and as I said before, most importantly of all, Ukraine's ability to move towards the West in terms of the European Union. So I think we should also recognize, contrasting with what Obama expected, that the Ukrainians, with our backing, but also we indirectly, did win a great success in Ukraine. And the question then becomes, can we on that basis then seek a compromise, given, as I said, all the other very, very important interests involved in the world?
I don't want our listeners to think I'm building up a straw man to knock it down, that I'm overstating what Francis Fukuyama said. This is what he said, and we all know him as the author of the End of History thesis. He said he expected a Russian defeat that will make possible a new birth of freedom and get us out of our funk about the declining state of global democracy. There are some liberal intellectuals who continue to globalize what is, in my view, a regional war that, of course, powerful countries across the Atlantic are involved in. So maybe it is a global struggle. I don't mean to contradict myself. I'm just bothered by the globalization of this war because that's when things can get complicated and escalate.
May I say something about Fukuyama specifically? There's a Fukuyama dynasty which behaves, as dynasties so often do. There was Francis I, and then there was Francis II, who disagreed quite strongly with Francis I. And now there's Francis III, who disagrees with Francis II, but agrees with Francis I. The unusual thing is that they're all the same man. Fukuyama's End of History thesis, frankly, much of it looks laughable in retrospect. And indeed, he himself backed away from it quite considerably.
Yes, he's written books since then, yes.
Francis II was an extremely acute and interesting analyst. I've used his books myself, to teach students on problems of democracy and state building and everything. Francis III, under the impact of the Ukraine war, has reverted to his intellectual grandfather again.
He's talking about the spirit of 1989 will live on thanks to a bunch of brave Ukrainians. I mean, maybe so. Our listeners might be wondering, who the hell am I to question Francis Fukuyama?
Well, no, it's just that I think he is totally wrong on this. I mean, the survival of Western democracy, the survival or the well-being of American democracy depends on how the next American elections are handled, not what happens in Ukraine. Ukraine is important, but not for that reason.
Any final thoughts, Mr. Ambassador, about my meandering interview here?
No. It's good questions, Martin. It's exactly right. And I agree with Anatol that the future of American democracy is up to Americans. This next couple of years will be key to this. We have problems. We have fixes that we need, but we own that. And it's up to us to solve that problem, the problems of our democracy. It is true that the Ukrainians care about Ukraine much more than the Russians. I think President Obama may have missed that part. And we have a stake, just from the standpoint of the rest of Europe. If President Putin is not stopped here, then there is a threat, there's a worry, there's a concern, a legitimate concern, motivates the Finns and the Swedes and the rest of NATO about further aggression. And this gets to your question about our support, U.S. support and British support for the Ukrainians. And the rest of NATO support for the Ukrainians. We do have a stake in the Ukrainians winning. Winning means that they are independent, sovereign, democratic, prosperous nation with the means to defend themselves, with the means to deter a further aggression. That's a win for Ukraine.
Putin's miscalculation has created a situation he hoped to avoid. NATO will be larger than it's ever been and more unified than it's been in quite a while, at least on the surface, at least now. I'll just leave you both with one final thought. In the New York Times a few days ago, I read an article that I found to be very moving. It was rather heartbreaking. At the beginning of the war, many Ukrainians who had no combat experience, they weren't military people, they were just ordinary citizens, signed up because their country had been invaded. And they were assigned to non-combat tasks, usually in the western part of the country, because, like I said, they weren't professional soldiers. But so many Ukrainian soldiers have been killed in combat now that some of these ordinary people have been forced to join combat units and have been killed. And they were killed within a day or two of going to the front. I mean, they didn't know what they were doing. Even if you do know what you're doing, you can still get hit with a missile or a bullet. And I feel when I read stories like that, I wonder if war weariness, of course, everyone's weary of war after a single day. I mean, war weariness to the point where it begins to place pressure on your government to get out of the war. I wonder.
Martin, you ask Ukrainians. You're right to talk about how the Ukrainians feel. Ask them. As of today, I don't know about tomorrow or the next day, but as of today, the Ukrainians are united in the answer to that question. They're ready to fight. They are still ready to fight. And as long as the West is giving them the tools to do that, they will fight.
I agree with the ambassador there. But, I mean, one also needs to look at war weariness on the Russian side, given the casualties they've suffered, especially among their elite units.
Yeah, I wonder about that as well. I mean, I don't know how much public opinion matters, but it must, right? Even in an autocracy.
That was my point, you see, about Putin not daring to declare mass mobilization in Russia. But I have to add that at that point, I mean, look, I understand that the Finns and Swedes being worried, but the idea that Russia is going to attack Finland or Sweden, or could do even if it wanted to, is ludicrous. Nor, of course, has Russia actually ever threatened to do so. But Putin, accepted membership of NATO for Finland and Sweden. He doesn't like it, but he basically shrugged his shoulders. One does have to, make this point very seriously, I think, that of course there is a threat to NATO from Russia, but it is one that has been generated really by what has happened in Ukraine. Now, I'm not blaming NATO for this, but the point is the idea of Russia attacking NATO now, whether from intention or capability. Look, if Russia
or by accident, though.
Accident, yes. And then there is always the risk of escalation as a result of Ukraine. But the idea of a premeditated Russian invasion of NATO, it purely in terms of military reality, cannot be considered serious.
I agree with that. But even a realist such as yourself, Anatol, understands that wars do start by accident.
Absolutely, which is a core argument for trying to end this war in Ukraine.
Yes, end this. Ambassador William Taylor and Anatol Lieven, we thank you for returning to the podcast. On the next episode of History as It Happens, the legacy of Phyllis Schlafly.
I would like to thank my husband Fred for letting me come today. I love to say that because it irritates the women's livers more than anything that I say.
With Roe versus Wade relegated to the dustbin of history, we're going to take a look back at the life and legacy of one of the most important women in American political history. That's next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.